Oh, good. I'm seeing lots of people here today. Yay. Hi, everybody. I'm just going to wait another couple seconds just to see if there's any other folks that come on in, and then we'll get started. Hopefully, you can see some slides. The first one just says welcome. We're going to go through a couple slides, and then I'll answer some questions. And it's only a couple, I promise. So I'll try not to talk too long. So I know you all have questions you want to get answered, and that's the important stuff. So I'll briefly go through a couple things, and then we'll get to your questions. Thanks for being here, everybody. Okay, I guess I'll get started, and then people can still come on in as they need to. I appreciate the thanks for hosting this. I saw from Zane. So thank you all for being here. I appreciate you taking time out and doing this. Today we have a little bit of time to talk about the 2+2 interview process. And like I said, I have a few slides that I'll go through just with some basic information that I think can be useful for everyone. As you can tell, I talk pretty quickly, so I'll do that. I'll talk pretty quickly and get through those, and then we'll save as much time as possible for folks to ask questions. So yeah, with that, we will get started. So this is me. I'm Geri. I am currently a professional MBA coach through Leland. As you can see, I worked for a period of time at Harvard Business School, actually for many years at Harvard Business School. And for a big chunk of that, for about 8 years, I was in the admissions office. And as an admissions officer, I had a chance to read thousands of applications and do thousands, probably maybe hundreds or thousands of interviews. And my focus while I was there was on the 2+2 program. So while I was there, I was part of the small team who launched 2+2. We decided that this was a way to get some really great folks in right from undergrad. There was, no way that there was no need to kind of have to wait for every single person until they worked for 4 or 5 years. We could identify people early in their career, admit them into the program, and then that gives them, lots of opportunity prior to coming to business school. So so I was part of that team, and it's been a program now for a long time. And as I'm sure you all know, lots of other schools have followed suit, and now almost all those top schools have a deferred program of sorts. Okay, so this is just a little bit of information that I was mentioning, sort of some interview tips that I think are helpful for anyone. So some of you out there may have, hopefully gotten there in your interview invites from HBS for this cycle, this 2+2 cycle. Others of you may be sort of thinking ahead and planning, you might be a junior now and planning ahead for maybe your senior year and applying next year. So, I'll try and keep that in mind. I know people here on the call might be in different situations depending, but I think, again, these interview tips, I think, will be applicable to anybody regardless. Whether you're going to be interviewing very shortly in the next few days or whether it might be a year from now. First thing is sort of know your whys. So one thing, I guess I'll take a sort of big picture view before I dive in here is, as I think many folks probably know, HBS's interview is a little bit different. So, they will have read your full HBS application prior to interviewing you. So they have the basic information, they have your resume, they know lots about you ahead of time. And so when you get to the interview stage, now they want to know not just kind of what you've done, but why you've done it. And so I think it's a great one of the things you can do to sort of prepare for your HBS interview is to think about the decisions you've made, whether it's the school you decided to go to, or it's the internships you chose, or it's the clubs you decided to participate in, or it's the full-time job you decided to take after graduation. Why? What drove those decisions? What were your motivations? And make sure you feel really comfortable being able to answer, the whys, because that's a lot of what HBS wants to do. It's not just about what you did, but the whys. And they want people who are thoughtful about their decisions, who are making sort of decisions with, strategically, thinking through those choices, not just kind of willy-nilly. And so that's what I mean by know your whys. The second thing is be vulnerable. And this is kind of an interesting one, but what I found when I was interviewing folks, the people that really made the biggest impression on me as an AdCom member during the interview stage was people who really were honest and genuine and could could sort of make fun of themselves in a scenario, or they could say, hey, yeah, here's something that that didn't go well for me. Here's a situation where, I was embarrassed or I failed or whatever. Those were sort of the folks that at the end I felt sort of most connected to, and they were really endeared themselves to me because they were being their true selves. They were being honest. They were being open. They weren't sort of pretending to be this sort of, what they assumed like a perfect applicant would need to be. So I think, I always say, don't be afraid in an interview to be vulnerable. I mean, if you think about the people that you probably most like and enjoy and are closest to you, it's because they're not afraid to show their true selves to you. And so I think you can feel comfortable doing that, honestly, as much as you feel okay with it, but like you can, be real and be honest in that interview, even with a school like HBS. They want real people in the classroom. They don't just want stats. They're envisioning you as a person in a room with 89 other folks. And, is this someone that people are going to want to be next to and want to be around and want to spend time with? And so I think that's important to remember. Share learnings. So again, this goes a little bit with that first one of know your whys, but it's more than just about like, here are my accomplishments, here's what I've done, but it's what did I learn from that experience? What's my takeaway from that experience? If I say I went and volunteered, in another country and I did X, Y, and Z while I was there, what did I learn about myself from that experience? What did I learn about that country? What did I learn about the work that I was doing? Could I articulate that to somebody in an interview? I think that's a great thing to think about as you're preparing. Make sure you can articulate, hey, here's what I know more. I know more about myself now. Here's what I took away from this experience. They want those folks who are introspective. They want folks who are, like I said earlier, sort of thoughtful. Because it's a lot about what you're doing sort of in these 2 years in the MBA program, right? Like, especially at HBS, you're reading these cases, you're learning about hundreds of companies. And the idea then is to take what you've learned there and now apply it, right, to other contexts. And so they want to make sure, are you a person who can do that, who can experience something, take something away, and keep that sort of learning with them and then apply it when necessary. Give others credit. So this may seem kind of silly, but I think, it's funny what I see when I'm helping clients with preparing for an interview is that there's one of two things that happen. There's some folks who end up saying sort of I the whole time, and they take all the credit for everything. And then there's other folks that say we the whole time, and they don't take enough credit. And so it can definitely go in either direction. But I think one thing to think about is you want kind of a balance, right? Like you want to be clear about, here's what I've done, right? If somebody asks you about, hey, you said, you were the president of this club and you took it from 20 members to 50 members. Okay, can you explain kind of how you did that? What was your approach? How did you make that work? What did you know? Did you accomplish everything you had hoped to in that role, et cetera? So you're sort of saying what you did. But I think as you're talking through that, you want to make sure you're also thinking about like who helped you along the way, right? Most often, there's very few things you're doing solely on your own, right? Where you're 100%, you can 100% take credit. Oftentimes there's team members that worked with you. There's classmates, there's professors, so I think it's just, that again, it's thinking about that balance. I want to be clear about, sharing and articulating what I've done and accomplished, but also it's great to be able to share with your interviewer, like also, my co-president along the way was invaluable. And without, him or her, we wouldn't have done this. That tells them that this is someone who can collaborate. This is someone who can work, well with other people. This is someone who's not afraid to give others credit. I think it says a lot about you when you can do that. So wanted to just share that. Prepare second and third level answers. You've probably heard this a little bit about HBS and their interview process, but they're generally not the kind of interview where they'll just say, hey, tell me sort of why you chose this major. And then you say, and then they move on. There's likely going to be sort of a second and third level. Okay, well, that's interesting. How come you did that? You chose that, major over that one? Or did you ever consider doing this instead? Or how come, so they'll kind of dig a little. That's kind of, what they are kind of known for doing is, digging a little deeper than that surface level. So, all of these questions are asking are about you and about your experience. And so you probably are able to answer those questions pretty well, but it's not a bad idea, in your practicing to kind of just, think about that a little bit. Like if they were to ask me that next level question, would I feel comfortable doing that? And then the last thing I was going to mention is let go of the script. I think there is sort of, again, it's another one of these balance things where you want to prepare, right? And that's part of what I help do with my clients is I, will do a mock interview with them. I had a couple of those today. And then after the mock, we'll talk about feedback. Hey, here's what I think you did really well. Here's some things you can practice and do a little bit better. Hey, don't forget to give other people credit. We'll kind of talk through exactly what I heard and we'll talk through sort of question by question from that mock. And one of the things that often gets asked is like, well, how much preparation should I do? How much is there too much? And I would say, yes, like there can be too much preparation. I think there are sometimes, understandably, everyone has worked so hard to get to this point. You have done so much work. to apply, get invited to interview. You know, you're pretty much halfway home, right, when you've gotten the interview invite. And so totally understandable that you're not going to walk into that interview unprepared. But there is a point where I think you almost feel, you can get to a point where you feel robotic, or you feel like you're talking from a script and you're not being honest, you're not being real or genuine in your answers. So I think, yes, it's good to practice. It's good to, do some mock interviews, whether it's with a coach or a friend or a family member. But what you don't want to do is have a script of answers and say, okay, if they ask me this, I'm going to say exactly this. And if they, ask me for a failure, I have, this exact example I'm going to give. And so you just want to make sure that when you walk in, or not walk in necessarily, because I think most of you guys will be doing them virtually, but that when you start this interview, you can let all that go. You've done the homework, you've done the preparation, and now you want to be real and just speak, as you normally would, versus sort of a script. Sometimes this would happen when I was in interviews with, when I was in AdCom, and the tough thing about that is, like, yes, this person sounded polished, but I don't really know them. I didn't get to know them. I don't really know what they're like. They never got off script, we would sometimes say. And so you want to make sure that they want to know the real you, and so you don't have to go in there saying everything perfectly and be 100% polished. That's not the expectation. So hopefully these tips were helpful, and it gives you a couple things to kind of think about and work on. Here's, me, and if you decide kind of after today, hey, I'd love to, work with Geri. I have an interview with HBS and it's happening next week and I want to do some preparation. I do have a package option where, like I kind of mentioned earlier, there's like this interview prep package where, I'll ask for your application, just the same exact thing that you submitted. I'll read through it just like I did, back when I was in AdCom, and I'll prepare a personalized interview in the same exact way. We would run through a mock or two, depending on what you need. And we'd have feedback afterwards, and I'd give you all, all the good and all the bad and all the ugly. And then that way you feel super confident when you go into the real thing. And I would obviously, give you a summary write-up of that mock interview too. And then the last piece I'll often do with folks is help them with their post-interview reflection. So I'm sure, many of you are aware, after your real interview with HBS, they will ask you to do a reflection. What was most meaningful from this interview? Is there anything else now that you've had a chance to reflect that you'd like to share? It's kind of a 400 word, that's all you have. And if they expect it to be returned in 24 hours. So I'll help my clients with, hey, I'm happy to take a look at it. I'll give you feedback and make sure you can submit that right away. And then that way you kind of know that that last piece of information you're sharing with the school, that post-interview reflection, is as strong as it can be. And so that's kind of the package there. So I think that is pretty much all I have inside of the prepared side of things. So thank you so much for listening. I hope this was helpful. And then at this point, I will go through the chat and see if there's some questions that I can help answer. Okay. So let's see, I'm going to scroll up a little bit. Okay. Okay, so somebody asked, Nishi asked, what's the most common mistake people make when talking about their goals or motivations? That's a great question to ask, because those kinds of questions do come up a fair amount in the HBS interview. I think, in fairness, with 2+2 applicants, the nice thing is that they know that you're early in your career. You've recently, graduated or will be graduating from school. And so I imagine this question is asking about goals and motivations, probably around professional goals. And so because you are early in your career, the expectations are different for a 2+2er than it is for someone who's been out in the working world for 5 years. Those folks, when they're asking them about their career goals, they really expect that answer to be, super polished, to have a really clear and defined plan about where they're headed. Now, with 2+2 applicants, you have a little bit more flexibility there, because again, like, they know you're just about maybe to start your first job. But what they are trying to get to with those kinds of questions around your goals, and why those are your goals, right, is they want to see, like, are you someone who has big ideas, who has big plans, who wants to utilize the MBA to the fullest, so that you can go and, maybe it's sustainability that you're really excited about. Can you express sort of this interest, like why you have this interest in sustainability? What is that motivation? Where did it come from? And yeah, I'm not 100% sure exactly what maybe that career is going to look like in sustainability, but maybe it'll look like A or B. These are things I'm going to have to figure out, and I want to figure out over the course of my next couple of years as I work and as I get my MBA. I'm going to much more, clearly define that goal. But here's kind of what that can look like. Because again, they want folks who have big goals, who have big dreams. They understand you might not have it super, clearly defined at this stage, but they want to make sure that you have something you're excited about and passionate about, and that, the MBA coming to their school is going to just help you reach that goal. So I would say the biggest mistake to this initial question, the most common mistake people make, is sort of maybe not having thought that through well enough. So, they're kind of hoping maybe they won't get asked too many questions about it. And so they kind of will just say, well, I'm thinking maybe something in sustainability, or maybe something in real estate, or maybe, and so they'll kind of list off a couple of things, but it won't really sound very convincing. It'll sound unfocused. And it won't sound like they really are super clear on why they want an MBA and how it fits into their goals. So I think you want to, craft that, think about that ahead of time, and sort of, what do I want to say? What is my career goal? Could I talk about it? Could I answer a second level or third level question about it? I think that's, what you want to think about when it comes to that. So hopefully that's a little bit helpful there in terms of that question. So the next person asked, Risha asked, how common is it to be asked why Harvard and why MBA? So this is really interesting. In the last year, was the last sort of round, not this current 2+2, but the one prior. This was the first time where I started hearing from clients that they were being asked this question. Historically, this was not something Harvard asked. And then the new director came in, and she must have kind of said, hey, let's start asking this, because I kind of want to know what I'm going to hear from these applicants. And so I would say it is something you should prepare for, because it is definitely, I didn't hear it 100% of the time. There's almost no question, honestly, that I heard people say I got asked every time. There's no question that they all ask. But I did hear, I would say maybe half the time, that people were asked why Harvard and or why MBA. So I think it is a great one to prepare for, just in case. Yeah, so that was kind of a quick one. Okay, let's see. Do you have any advice for the post-interview reflection? So the post-interview reflection, I think, is, I love that they do this. I know it kind of can be hard, because you're like, oh, I just got through this interview and now I have one more thing to do. And it would be nice to not have to worry about that. I think the good thing is that you don't have to worry too much, because they are not expecting sort of the same type of, product that you submitted for your essay. They're not expecting that. That took you weeks or months to write. The expectation here is much lower. But the reason why I like it, and why I think, in terms of kind of advice for it, is because you get to have the last word. You get to remind them, hey, here's something we talked about that I'm really glad we got to talk about. I'm really excited that I got to share with you why I'm so passionate about X or Y, or I'm really glad that I got to tell you about, this event that I organized and how successful it was. You can kind of remind them about something you talked about, and kind of you get a chance to have the last word, which I think is really nice. So in terms of, advice for it, I think you want to be, you don't want to use it as an opportunity to, hey, I need to remind them about all my accomplishments. No, you want to use that, short post-interview reflection to answer the question that they're asking you, which is just, what was a highlight from the interview? And is there anything else that you have, that you've reflected on since the interview? So you want to make sure you're answering the prompt itself, and not trying to use this as a, hey, I got to remind them of all the things I've ever done and all my accomplishments, because that will just get lost in the mix. Like, they won't be able to sort of take that in, right? It's too much information. So you want to kind of define something specific. The other piece of advice I would have is to, use it as a chance to maybe a redo. If there was a question that you kind of feel like, I really didn't nail this one as well as I could have, this is a chance in the post-interview reflection to say, hey, if we had more time, I would have loved to expand a little bit more, on this, or I would have also liked to share, this when we talked about, this project of mine. So it's a chance for you to kind of revisit something that maybe you feel like, oh, I could have done a little bit better of a job on, and kind of, make that answer just a little bit stronger. So I think that's an opportunity to use it, for that as well. I think that's, a worthwhile, usage of that post-interview reflection. Yeah, otherwise I would say shorter is better. There's no need to kind of use every single, word that they give you there. If you answer the prompt and you're done and it's a little bit under word count, no worries. Short and sweet is great. And I think the other piece of advice I would just give is, don't forget to thank. The first thing you should do in the post-interview reflection is thank your interviewer. And thank you for sort of their time and, making the interview, hopefully, the interview a good experience. So I think that's always a good thing to remember to do too. Yeah, so that's kind of my advice for post-interview reflection. Okay, so then Zane said there's instructions not to not receive help on the post-interview reflection. Should we have others look at ours? So yeah, I mean, I think across the board, right? When the admissions committees, whether it's Harvard or anywhere else, are saying, hey, please, don't get help on this, they need to be careful. They want to make sure that somebody else is not writing something for them. And, so whether it's an essay or whether it's a post-interview reflection, right? Those instructions are basically to say, hey, don't have someone else write this for you. And certainly I, would not do that with my clients. My goal is just to review it and then, give them some feedback on, hey, I think this is a great approach, or, hey, maybe you might want to be a little bit more succinct in this part, or, hey, actually, I don't think you need this like third example here, of something you talked about. So it's like, it's like that. There's no, writing or rewriting for the person. So I think you're in the clear, even given the instructions. If you had somebody else take a look at it, again, as long as they are not writing it or rewriting it for you, right? They're kind of being hands off and just giving you, sort of some feedback on your content. And so I think that's the intent there. In terms of, I think though, the good thing about the post-interview reflection is it's so quick. Again, like I said, it's not, the expectation is not like with an essay, you may have 5 people read it. That certainly is not the expectation in here. This is a 24-hour turnaround. So maybe you have one person look at it, maybe you have a coach, or maybe you have a friend, and then that's it. Like, don't worry about, hey, I got to have lots of people look at this, because, there's no time for that, and they don't sort of expect it to be perfect in that kind of a way. Okay. So Tony asked about sort of the most challenging questions asked, and, and more general ones too. I think you can probably, if you do a search, right, you can look up, prior HBS interview questions being asked. And, I think there's lots of lists out there. So I think you can get a fair amount of that. That's like, that's out there. I think the interesting thing about any of those questions is that, HBS, like I was saying earlier, is really unique in that they don't have a set of questions that they need to ask, or that they all pull from. Other schools, I think, have a little bit more of like, here's our set of questions, and you can, pick and choose as you like. HBS really gives their interviewers free reign. So there is no set list. So it's very likely that, like, you could have 5 different people interview you at HBS, and you're going to have 5 different interviews, and 5 different sets of questions. And so there really isn't a way to kind of say, oh, let me prepare for every possible question that's going to be asked. Then it's impossible to do. What I think is, unique about the HBS interview is that they really are diving into what you've told them. So a good way to think about it is like, can I look at every single thing I've shared with them and stand behind it, right? If they ask me about this tiny little thing on my resume, do I feel comfortable talking about it? If they ask me about this bullet, if they ask me about this thing I did 3 years ago, can I talk to it? If I go back into my application form and there's that area where you talked about your, employment, you talked about your internships, oh yeah, what did I say to them there? If they, mention something that I wrote in one of those little sections on the application form, do I feel comfortable talking about all those things? And so I think it's a good idea to go back through your application, every single section, every single little thing you wrote in there, and make sure you're comfortable with all of it. Go through the resume, go through all of your essays again. I know you're probably super sick of looking at them and never want to look at them again, but it's a good idea just in case they reference something from there that you don't have to say, oh shoot, what was I talking about? You want to make sure you're super comfortable with all that stuff. And then, like I shared a little bit ago in sort of one of the earlier slides, all of those things, thinking about, your motivations, your whys behind those things. I think those are great ways to do some preparation. And then, certainly you can kind of take a look out there and see, what are some typical, what might be called typical, but they're, typical interview questions, but it's very much personalized and based on your application. So there's not a lot of like generic or behavioral stuff that's in there. They may throw 1 or 2 in there, right? The one caveat, the one thing I will say is that often, not always, and again, nothing is ever always, but often they do ask sort of at the very end of the interview, what else would have liked me to ask? And so they give you sort of an open-ended question. So that's sort of one good one to prepare for, just in case. Like, it's a little bit hard to prepare because it's kind of based on, they say, hey, what else would you have liked me to ask? it's kind of based on what just occurred in that 30 minutes, right? So what did I get a chance to talk about? You have to do a quick calculation in your head, like, I got a chance to talk about this, 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 and this, but oh shoot, they didn't ask me about this. And this is something I want to leave with them. I want to mention to them so they, remind them this thing about me. And so it's a little bit hard to prepare for because it's based on how the interview went, but just kind of know that, maybe you have an idea or two in your back pocket of something you might be able to pull out and talk about, or say, hey, we didn't get a chance to talk about this. If we had, I would have told you about how I've recently started to learn how to play chess and it's been great, and can you maybe have something in mind? But yeah, so that's on sort of the question front. Let's see. So someone asked, could you reiterate how to balance between preparedness and scriptedness? Really fair question. This is like, a balance, as this question has asked. I think the difference is, I think about Amazon interviews. I don't know how many of you kind of have ever interviewed for Amazon or know how they work, but they have certain buckets of questions that you're going to get, or certain topic areas. And for that kind of an interview, right, you prepare in advance. You say, okay, I have 10 examples of things, and I'm going to map each of my examples to one of these buckets of questions, right? And you kind of know, okay, these 5 go with this bucket. These 5 I could use again here. You're kind of mapping specific answers to specific buckets. So that's kind of what I mean by scriptedness. Like, you don't want to have it so fully, pre-prepared that you're trying to say, oh, wait, which example was I going to use for this kind of a question? Oh yeah, I'm going to use this. Okay. And then you say it. I think, and then, you've said it so often that it kind of sounds like you're reading from a script rather than just kind of off the cuff and natural. So I would say that's the difference. Like, you don't have to kind of map out, here's the exact, these are my 10 things I want to mention, or 10 experiences or 10 examples, and I'm going to make sure I map those to every kind of question. It's sort of a fool's errand because there's too many questions. You can't possibly map, all your experiences to everything. And I think what that ends up doing is sort of getting you in your head too much. And now you're worried about, like, oh, wait, what was I supposed to use? And then, again, it doesn't come off as genuine and real. So I think that's what I mean by sort of like over preparedness or scriptedness, versus just preparedness means, hey, run through, do a mock or two, again, whether that's with a coach or a friend or something, especially if you haven't done a ton of interviews, interviewing is a skill like any other. And the more you do it, the better you get at it. And so even if your interviewer with a friend who is a friend is not asking you the exact questions HBS will, you're just getting comfortable with the format. You're getting comfortable talking about yourself. You're getting comfortable, talking through an example of a project that you worked on, or a research, some research you did, or your internship. It just gets you better at it, So I think that's, and like I said earlier, reading everything in your application, that's a great way to prepare. Thinking about your motivations and your whys, that's a good way to prepare. So I think those are all things that fall into the category of like good preparedness versus sort of the other idea, the other end of it, which is like the scriptedness. So hopefully that helps a little bit. Somebody asked, do they actually evaluate the application holistically after your interview? So actually, it's interesting. The holistic review has happened prior, and then the interview at that stage, after the interview, they're only sort of reviewing how you did on that interview. And then that piece, that interview piece, gets sort of attached essentially to sort of the holistic review that's already been done. And everything then gets sent over to the managing director. So there's not like and that managing director then is kind of looking at what's coming into her and saying, okay, great, here's the feedback I'm getting from every single interview, and how they went. And then that sort of director has to, decide sort of the class as a whole. So she's not doing a whole holistic review again. At that stage, everybody who's gotten to interview, the assumption is you could be in the class. You have what it takes. They don't need to do another review. It's just at that stage, she's kind of saying, okay, how many more of these kind of profiles can I take? How many more people from here? Or how many people from this company? Or, you know what I mean? So there's not like a second review at that stage, I would say. Hopefully that's helpful. Okay. Let's see. The next question, somebody asked, what kinds of traits does HBS look for in applicants during the interview? So I think, it's similar in some ways to other interviews in that, like, they want people who are articulate. They want people who can explain an idea. Sometimes they'll ask you something complicated, like, oh, you mentioned in your resume, this very complicated, research project you worked on. Can you summarize it for me? they want to know that you are a person who can take a big idea or something complicated and then summarize it and explain it in an efficient and logical manner, because you're going to be doing a lot of that in the classroom, right? So that's one of the big things they're looking for is, every day in the classroom, you're reading a case, you're needing to sort of analyze, you're needing to come up with opinions, and you're taking something, maybe a 30-page case, and then you're sort of needing to be able to really, clearly articulate your idea, your perspective, your opinion. And so some of what they're doing is that they're kind of seeing fit for the classroom, right? I think the other thing they're doing is sort of not fit for the academics of the classroom, but fit for the cohort of people, right? So they're also trying to assess, and I kind of alluded to this a little bit earlier, but what is this person like? Are they someone who people are going to want to be working closely with? You're going to sit in a classroom with them, every day for 2 years. Like, is this someone who's going to fit well in that way? Are they going to be a good community citizen? Are they going to be the kind of person who gives back? Are they going to be able to collaborate well, right? So they're trying to imagine you in, again, the academic setting and also sort of the personal, cohort setting, and seeing, is that mix there? I think the other thing is they want people with opinions and perspective, right? So again, part of that academic environment is, not just can I read a case and kind of come to class prepared, but I need to have an opinion. I need to have perspectives on things. And so they're also looking for people who can kind of take everything that they've seen and done in their life, from where they grew up to what school they went to internships, kind of use all of that to help bring forth a perspective that will be interesting in the classroom and that will make the conversation and the discussion better. So, that's, I say, another thing that they are looking for, when they're doing this interview. This is all going on sort of in the background of their head, like as they're asking you questions. And so there's a lot happening, in their head as it's going on. Okay. I'm probably just going to be able to take, I think, one more question. Let's see. Oh, this is interesting. Okay. Nicholas asked, for what types of questions do you suggest the STAR method or, would be most effective? Or should all answers be not too scripted and unformatted with that? So this is kind of interesting because I think this is very personal. Some people, in order to stay on track with a question, that they're being asked in an interview, they like to have a specific way to approach the answer, right? They know, this STAR method, right? Situation, task, they like to know, hey, when I'm going to get a question, I'm going to respond in this manner. And this helps me stay focused so I don't go off track with my answer and I don't, sort of spend too much time or talk too long. So some people like having a very specific format in which to answer. I know other people, me included, I think that would add a layer of complexity to me. For me, that would sort of take me off task, and it would make it hard for me to be sort of genuine in my answer because I'd be thinking about, okay, STAR, where am I now? And so for me, kind of adding that layer actually makes it harder. But for others, I know they love it, and it really makes sure that they are staying on track with their answers. So I think that, for your question, I think it really depends on you and how you like to interview. If you are someone who likes that idea of having a framework, then go for it. And I think you can decide, when that's appropriate, when it's needed. Maybe you only use it for sort of multi-part questions. Maybe only when the questions start to get a little bit more complicated, or like I said, there's sort of 2 pieces to them or 3 pieces to them. And maybe you decide, hey, I don't need that format when they're just asking me something more simple. And so you can kind of use it in that way, so it's really kind of a personal preference on that front. But I think that's all I can get to for now. I'm so sorry. I know I didn't get to everyone. I'm sure there's lots of great questions out there. I could probably talk for another long period of time. But I have some work I have to follow up with on my current clients and some mock interviews that I need to finish writing up and get off to folks. So thank you all so much for your time. I hope this was useful and helpful. And good luck for all of you that have your interviews. And then for folks that this may be happening in the future, good luck to you too. And I appreciate you all attending. Thanks so much.